What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Mindset Podcast. Today, we are joined by none other than Mr. Mark Trowbridge. I had to throw on the Gator gear for this episode. I usually don't do it to upset people and lose an audience, but I had to do it for Mark. Mark is not only a proud Gator, but he is also the former president of the Alumni Association for the University of Florida, which is a huge deal. One of the many things that Mark is involved with, of course, president and CEO of the Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce, which is a huge chamber of commerce down here in South Florida that we all love going to their events. And Mark is a very busy man. Keeping Grant Miller humble is one of the many things that Mark is
Oh,
charged with. But Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for being with us.
Gabriel, Anthony, great to be with you guys. Thanks so much for the invitation. And of course, what a great way to start today. I really appreciate not only the invitation, but the opportunity to chat with you guys a little bit about what's on your mind, what's on my mind, and hopefully on the mind of folks who are listening to the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, we're honored to have you, and we'll just get right to it. In true mindset fashion, we'll always begin with our two warm up lightning round questions. And the first one, Mark, is you, if you could have your own late night talk show, who would be the person that you first invite as a guest? I know you're used to this podcast or interview world, so you're very
Sure.
well versed in how to conduct an interview. Who would be the first person you have on your late night talk show?
Well, I've often thought that most of my humor and talent was better for late night after dark, if you will. But I'm going to say Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Hmm.
And if you're not familiar with her, she is an author and historian who wrote the book Team of Rivals, of which the movie Lincoln is based on, that Steven Spielberg adapted. And if you know a little bit about her, she's also written books about the Roosevelts. She's written books on leadership. And I took one of her master classes during COVID when all of us were looking things for things to do and content to devour, and absolutely fell in love with her all over again. But mostly because she takes um, a historic figure and really peels back all of the layers to see them as the vulnerable person, maybe the flawed person that they are. And I remember reading her book, Team of Rivals, and being mesmerized by the characters who are all historically accurate characters. But thinking about somebody who had won a very close election and said, I'm going to put everybody around me who I beat because they're going to make me a better leader. And I think that's a great bit of advice for even folks today to reach out to their rivals and say, how can we collaborate going forward? I wish our local elected officials did that more in their success, but we'll leave that for another conversation.
I love that so much. I think there's so much power in that, and like you mentioned, if only some of our local leaders would adapt that concept. But thank you so much for that. I was reading this question when we were creating them, Anthony and I, and it's kind of tough because I'm a huge late night show fan, if you will. I
Yeah,
My personal favorite is Jimmy Fallon. I know he's one of the more popular ones, but just reading up on his story, he does have a podcast, I believe, on one of my favorite podcasts, How I Built This, and he really his story of just the way he conducted his journey throughout moving to LA in the beginning, and then really just going to little clubs and comedy nights and stuff, and really that a lot of people don't see that version of Jimmy Fallon. They see the guy 11-12 o'clock at night, late night, with all the
sure.
celebrities. But I was always interested to know, and I think it'd be interesting to have him. If I were asking myself that question, I'd love to flip the script on someone that's so used to being the interviewer, if you will, and have him on the hot seat. So that's such an interesting question. Thank you for that.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned Jimmy Fallon because, of course, he is, the person who is inhabiting the chair at the Tonight Show
Yeah,
now. But I can remember being in college and, you know, uh, we didn't have all of the access to streaming platforms and all of the wonderful content that's out there today. So a lot of us would watch the end of the Tonight Show because it was the lead into the David Letterman show, and everybody was staying up late at 12:35. No way were we ready for bed yet in college. And two, you didn't necessarily want to watch Johnny Carson because he was a little stuffy and maybe a little bit of a different generation. But we were all ready at 12:30 when David Letterman came in. But guys like Letterman and guys like Johnny Carson, I think that they thrived at being in programs like that because they didn't like being interviewed. They were actually rather shy in that regard. And even when Letterman, went through some of his own challenges and he'd want to, be invited on, talk about his heart ailments or his show, he shied away from that. And I think, Johnny Carson was notoriously painfully shy as well. But if you put a microphone in front of them and they can kind of drive the conversation, well, they thrived in that. So well said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's just some people in this world that really do a good job of that, and I have to agree they're some two of the best. But as we move on to our second question of this little lightning round, we were just talking about it off the air, and let's make it interesting. So, if you could change places with anyone in this world, dead or alive,
Yeah.
who would it be, and for what reason?
So I struggle with this one because I think there's an amazing number of folks in history who are now dead that it might have been interesting to live in their times, even just to experience a world that was a little bit more challenging. You were dealing with, whether it was wars or illness or things like that. But I'm a big movie buff, and so I probably see uh, two or so movies a week. So we have a great little art cinema here in Coral Gables, and another theater that's here. And so, I went and saw a movie yesterday. Had seen one earlier in the week, but the one that I saw about 2 weeks ago starred Tom Hanks, and it's a movie called A Man Named Otto. The character is not necessarily significant in the response to this question because I think Tom Hanks could play any type of character. I mean, he's been Forrest Gump, he's been all of these different folks who he inhabits. But this was so out of the ordinary for him because he plays a guy who's just like super cranky, who everything is very frustrating to him. Even if people drive the wrong way down the street, can't
Hmm.
parallel park. There's a whole scene to that. But I think he would be fascinating to change places with. One, I've always fancied myself that if I didn't do this job, maybe I could be an actor. But he's someone that people also, I think, admire. They
Hmm.
consider him one of the nicest people in Hollywood. I try to emulate that in my role in our chamber, and being, a good, nice, responsive guy. But I also think he's gotten to influence, you know, not only his profession, but folks around him. Think of what he's done for World War II veterans. And
Mm.
he's used his platform to really do good. And I think for me, that would be an opportunity if you get to change places with someone like to really experience that. One, I think it solidifies what you're trying to do in your daily life, but two, gives you, kind of all the warm fuzzies that go along with it.
Well, Mark, it's never too late to go into acting. I don't know why you're ruling it out.
I
You never
don't
know. You can get into it right now.
Every single time that I go see a show, I went and saw a play on Sunday, and I was talking to the artistic director,
Yeah.
and I was teasing her because she's staging a show in a couple of months that one of my friends is going to be in, and I said, I have my headshot in the car if you need it, if you're still casting any parts for that. And she just laughed and she goes, "Did you ever want to be an actor?" I said, "What do you think I'm doing all day long? I'm auditioning for whatever that next
Oh, I
opportunity
love
is."
it.
So
I love it.
when I was growing up, my parents had this belief that I was a kid who liked to eat, so I better find an actual job that could pay to cover the ability for me to go out and eat. So
I know,
it
right?
was a compromise.
Sometimes I feel like I'm just trying to make money so I can just eat, just for eating. Money allocated just to eat, right?
Hey
Because I'm a
man,
foodie.
Maslow's
Gabe loves to eat.
basic needs. You can probably crash on Gabriel's sofa if something goes south or vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
But he's not going to be feeding you for the rest of your life. So you got to be able to stand up on your own 2 feet. And you guys are Miami boys, so we've got a
That's
little
right.
bit of everything here
That's
in the
right.
305.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's great, Mark, and we appreciate your candidness with us in those questions. And it, now every time I see you, Mark, I'm gonna believe that you're just walking around with a headshot wherever you go.
It's
Anywhere you go,
absolutely true. It's not a
you have
good picture. It's not a,
yeah.
I used to tease some of my mentors when they put their picture up, you know, for an event or on their website. And I'm like, what year was that taken? And now I'm the guy totally doing that. I'll say to our photographer, I'm like, whatever's happening here, let's fix that. No gray
Yeah.
here.
Oh man.
Whatever you have to do, airbrush.
Yeah.
That's why I was teasing you guys about your hair earlier. It's like you wake up with perfect hair.
Awesome, Mark. Well, you in my book, you're synonymous with Miami. I mean, everybody that I come in contact with, even up here in Gainesville, that I mention your name, Mark Trowbridge, and they immediately lighten up and share great stories of how they met you, or
That's
anything
fair.
that they found interesting about you. And that's the kind of person I think we all strive to be at one point in our lives, where we feel embedded in our community. And for those who don't know you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be where you are, and what you do today on a daily basis.
So, as I was asking both of you before we got started, sort of growing up here, I grew up in Ohio and my family, we were in the restaurant business. My mom was a school teacher. So, my very first job was, one of those roll your sleeve up jobs where you're working in the family business. I washed a lot of dishes when I was a kid in my dad's, family restaurant. And so, from a very early age, we were always taught to be very, conscientious about, work and service, whether it was through our church or volunteering. But when I moved to Miami after finishing at University of Florida, I didn't know anybody here. It could have been a little bit easier to go, one, stay in Gainesville, two, maybe move back closer to home, which was now in Central Florida. Um, but I just fell in love with Miami, and Miami today, even 30 years later, still has that sort of character of kind of, grabbing you and pulling you closer. And over 30 years, not only are developing a lot of relationships, but you're transforming yourself just as the community is transforming itself. So,
Mm.
not a lot of people know, but my very first job was working at the University of Miami. So I was like a hurricane for a few years on paydays, I would say. I'm a hurricane when they hand me my paycheck. But they used to harangue me and harass me to no end because
Mm.
uh, they just could. And Miami and Florida at that point were like really not connected. What we weren't playing each other in any type of football or really any sport, not even in basketball. I think once in a while we would play baseball against each other, but Miami was really good then. They're kind of like we are now, what they were in 80s and 90s. And so, I arrived here about 8 weeks before Hurricane Andrew.
Mm.
So that was kind of eye opening. I'd never been through a hurricane, but it really taught me, about dealing with, a crisis and, remaining calm. But I also realized that crises tend to bring people very close together. And so, folks who were, friends 30 years ago remain friends today because we went through that experience. But probably for me, the thing that really laid out a path was I got involved here locally with a program called Leadership Miami. And University of Miami put me through that program. It was a year-long program that really taught you about all aspects of the community. You looked at it from an economic development standpoint, education, nonprofit, and we went all around the community. And I was late every single time because that was way before there was GPS and Waze. You couldn't even print out a map like on
Yeah.
on your computer, and it'd be sometimes in the Hialeah City Hall or it'd be down
Mm.
in South Dade and learning about the agriculture community. But I got a really great view about what makes Miami really hum. And even all these years later, 25 years later, a lot of those things are still very relevant today. And so I'm very grateful to that program. Every professional opportunity I've had since then has come through one degree of separation from Leadership Miami, someone who's referred me or recommended me or said, hey, I knew him when. And it also taught me that, you could get very involved in this community very quickly. It just requires you to raise your hand. I know some places where you move, maybe in Atlanta, Chicago, big cities like that, you sort of wait your turn, right? But I think about even you, Anthony, and the work you're doing with Casa Familia and others. It's like they're looking for enthusiasm, folks that are willing to roll up their sleeves. And like I said, that went all the way back to the earliest days, whether we were volunteering through our church growing up or helping my mother get her classroom ready every fall for, the kids to come back. There was always something we were doing. There was no hanging around. We had nothing to keep us busy. We didn't play video games back then. And, you know, between that and, just getting out and breathing fresh air, it really set the tone.
Yeah, I think that's something that Miami, and I'm a travel, connoisseur. I loved going and traveling, especially here in the States. I feel like a lot of people don't give the US enough credit for the amount of
Agreed.
places that there are, and such amazing, and beautiful cities. But there's just something about Miami that you can literally just show up and you can talk to one person at a bar or at a mall and you can already get involved. And I think maybe the only closest city I can really say that is maybe New York, just because it's so populated.
Sure.
But there's a different energy when you're here in Miami, and people, um, despite the traffic that everyone has to deal with, I feel like people get over that and really start to see how genuine people are, and how willing people are to work. And I guess a question that I have for you, Mark, is as you graduated from University of Florida, you came down here to Miami. What is it exactly that you had to do to really get yourself plugged in? Because I mean, I can't imagine as a recent graduate now at 23 years old
Hmm.
going to a brand new city and just like immersing myself. It's a lot easier said than done. Like, what did you do at that point in time to really get yourself involved?
So that's a great question. And, I arrived here when I was 23, so exactly your age. And, I really was fortunate because it was a good job market. I had two great offers, either to come work at the University of Miami or work at UNC at Charlotte. And Charlotte was a really sleepy city back in 1992. It wasn't the banking epicenter that it is today. And UNC Charlotte was, like the third or fourth of the UNC schools that, people really talked about. It might be a different story today if one were sort of, flipping a coin. But what I saw even in those early days is that the University of Miami even sort of emulated what Miami was. So it was, come in, you have your day to day job, but, do you want to teach a class? Okay, great. Let's get you to do that. Do you want to do academic advising? That was a beginning roadmap that said, you know, again, if you show a little bit of interest, if you show a little bit of chutzpah, then there's an opportunity there to be more involved. My very first volunteer experience was I was a driver at the old Lipton tennis tournament. So I'd
Hmm.
been here a few months. A buddy of mine said, "Hey, we're recruiting volunteers." And I'm like, "Well, what do you do?" They go, "Well, you drive players around to their hotel, to go to the store, if they need to get their racket restrung." It was a little tiny tournament at that point in comparison to what it is today out on Key Biscayne. So, you know, they check your driving record, you're halfway decent. They give you at the time a Lexus to drive around. Of course, I was driving like a very old Honda Accord. So I'm like, hey, you couldn't take it home, but you could drive it for 4 or 5 hours, every day.
Yeah.
And you just picked up players. And I remember the commentator, Pam Shriver, who had been a top player on the women's tour, especially doubles. She won a lot of mixed doubles Grand Slams with Martina Navratilova. So she was broadcaster by then. So I had to drive her quickly back to the Intercontinental Hotel and then bring her back to the site. And she's like, I have literally 20 minutes to get there and back. And I'm like, we're going to make it. And as we're driving, she says, well, tell me about you. Like, do they pay you to do this? And I said, no, I'm a volunteer. It blew her mind that somebody would take time off of work to then volunteer. And I said, well, we love Miami and we love our community. And we want anybody who experiences Miami or who experiences this tournament to, have great feelings about our community. And that just blew her mind. And she says, so don't get paid, and you drive me, and I'm a pain in your rear end telling you to hurry up. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much it. Well, it turned out at the time she was chair of a subcommittee on the board of trustees of the university she went to school at. And I was working in student affairs, and that was the committee she was chairing. She goes, well, wait a minute. She says, I'm supposed to give a report about, sort of the state of, students today in the 90s and how they're dealing with, all these various issues. And at the time, there was a significant issue around binge drinking. And I said, Harvard University just did a longitudinal study. It's like 20 years of looking at practices and things of students. And I said, she gave me literally her home address. I sent her a copy of the study for her to use, and she wrote me back this lovely, thank you letter. But that to me is a microcosm again of opportunity, is that you can just be in a car with somebody who, to me, she was a famous, former tennis pro who's
Right.
still commentating today. And every time I see her on TV, I'm like, you're welcome for that report, Pam. But I think that's really the difference here, is that every door is open. It's different, I think, in other communities where you have to figure out either how to open that door or push it open a little bit farther to slip through it. Here, the door is open. We want folks that raise their hand, want to get involved, and that's really all that I had to do. And the same opportunity happened at the University of Florida. I got involved with our local alumni club. No, it was a club that was not very good. Over 100 Gator clubs, and Miami was one of the clubs that really wasn't very good. That just doesn't make sense, right? We have so many alumni that live in Miami-Dade County, so many incredible alumni in that group, and we stunk. And so I just got lucky because, I got elected president, and I said, we're going to change the mindset, right? We're just going to change how we view ourselves, and we're going to engage our younger alumni. And again, the same thing that was my blueprint became the blueprint for the club, and that was how my experience with UF really took off. And there hadn't been an alumni president from Miami since the 80s when I was alumni president, over 25 years. That's crazy.
Yeah,
because there was just no leadership here. There was no investment.
Right.
So
well, we're working on changing that, right, Mark? Bringing some
we need
attention.
another one. There hasn't been one since, and that was now already 10 years, so it's
10
time.
years. Yeah. Well, Mark, what's fascinating to me of your story, and I feel like it's really the Miami story and the story of many other great leaders who I admire, mentors even, is really two things. And you just shared it now. It's the way to scale, to move up, to get to know people, to become part of a community. One, you have to put yourself in the right position, almost like that saying, right time, right place. And that really takes minimal effort. You just got to find out where to go and just be there. And then the second part of that is to have a good attitude, because you can be there. You can be in the right place, doing the right thing, the right job, but you have a bad attitude about it. You're not having a good day and you don't, I don't know, whatever. But like you, Mark, you had a good attitude about that job that you were doing, and you weren't even paid. Nonetheless, you had a good attitude. You had every reason to not have a good attitude and not have a conversation because whatever, you don't need to, but you did it anyway, and then one thing led to another, and it's a snowball effect. So it's something that I admire about you, Mark, and it's something that I think a lot of people share as well, being in the right place at the right time, and while you're there, make the most out of it. But shifting to one of our last questions for you, Mark, is you know you've been around for a long time. You know a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people have given you a lot of great advice, and you've given a lot of people great advice yourself. I'm sure you have a few mentors and mentees. What is the best advice you have ever been given?
Well, I appreciate that that question so much, because I think it really informs exactly what we've been talking about today, and that is around the concept of leadership. And you're absolutely right. If you're going to raise your hand and commit to something, it isn't just your attitude, it's your stick to itiveness, it's following through. I mean, folks that do that here, I think, immediately make a really great name for themselves. But I worked for a gentleman named Hank Adorno when I worked for the Super Bowl. And one of the things that Miami's really, really proud of is that we've had a dozen or so Super Bowls that have come to South Florida, more than any other community over the history of Super Bowls. And it's a collegiate, not a collegiate, a collegial activity, in the sense that we collaborate with, neighboring counties, and we bring together as many partners as possible. But everything comes back to really volunteers. And, I got to do that job, and I worked and wrote speeches for Hank Adorno, who was the chair of the board. And one of the things he said to me, he says, "Oh, you're involved in some things." He says, "How do you pick and choose?" And then we talk about that if I was driving him somewhere. And he says, "Let me give you some advice." He says, "If you're going to join an organization," he said, "have the expectation that you're going to one day lead it. It's great to be on a board and have your name on the letterhead and you're one of 30, but have the aspiration that if you're going to give your time, talent, and energy to an organization, then do it with the mindset that you're going to lead." And that has always been, sort of, the blueprint that I followed. So if you look at, several of the organizations that I've been involved with, sometimes it happens with, a methodical approach, and sometimes it happens serendipitously. The UF Alumni Board is a very large board, and the fact that we hadn't had a Miami in 25 years didn't bode well for anybody out of South Florida. But, some things came together, timing was right, and I took on a really big project working with all of our regional vice presidents, and, you got noticed. So a lot of times it really is about getting noticed, and they're like, this guy, you know, maybe we ought to take another look at him. And I actually had somebody say that to me, and I was like, should I feel good about that? Is that sort of an odd way to look at it? But it's fine.
Yeah.
And then you've got to do that for others as well. But I got asked this morning. They said, "Oh, are you involved with such and such an organization?" And I said, "Yeah, I just finished a term as being chair." And they're like, "Well, what was that like?" And I said, it's always going to be more work, but the work comes with a great satisfaction. I was sitting. It's a choral group here called Seraphic Fire, and our culminating event was Saturday night, and just sitting in the audience at the Arch Center, listening to 1,600 people jump out of their seats at the end of it, cheering, and just being over the moon listening to the music, reminded me for just a
Mm,
brief moment, like, this is why we do what we do.
mm,
I'm not the person standing on the stage. I don't make music,
mm,
but I make sure that we're in a place where we can be successful along with my colleagues. And if you get a chance to lead in that way, one, you have influence, obviously, and two, you have responsibility, because at the end of the day, you have to protect and preserve the mission of the organization. Sometimes make tough decisions, but you want to leave the organization in much better shape than when you found it. And so I always appreciate those words that Hank said: if you're going to join to lead.
Yeah, that's so good. And I want to add a little bit to that. And I think, part of your success, Mark, and, correct me if I'm wrong, and we were just talking about it a minute ago, is your ability to say yes, right? Like, I'm just thinking about that scenario with Pam in the car, you driving her around. Like, you could have easily said no to that, volunteer work, slave work, labor, whatever it
Sure.
is you want to call it, but you might have not had gotten that connection. And I think even now, I mean, me being in the video and the filmmaking industry, I have so many buddies that they'll, no, I'm not going to take that opportunity. They don't, it's not paying enough. Like, but you never know who you're going to meet at that opportunity. And, whatever, if you're not doing anything that day, like, I still do it to this day just to be able to get to connect with people. I think saying yes, and like you said, Anthony, showing up is just half the battle. And then having that good attitude is so important. And I want to add to that advice, and this was something that you kind of touched upon, Mark, about how people were recognizing you, and I think a lot of what Miami is, and I'm sure in other places as well, is your network. We talk a lot about the network in our podcast and the people that you know. But I received a good piece of advice a few months back, and someone told me it's knowing people is very important, but what's even more important is who knows you, right?
Hmm.
Who can remember your name, and who can really, who can you impress to, to stand out in front of those people? And you might have a long laundry list of contacts in your phone, but if you call them up and they're like, "Who's this? How do I know you?" It might be a little bit sour. And I think, your story represents that so well, is that, you were turning heads. People are like, "Hey, I think we should give this Mark guy another chance. Like, I think he's doing something really cool." So I just think that's a huge lesson, not only for us, but I think for the people listening, is a lot of people are in positions like us, graduating, they're trying to get involved as possible, maybe applying to jobs, starting businesses, whatever it may be. And just I think that small shift in mindset is, okay, I want to know as many people, but how can I leave a lasting impact in those people's lives so that they can remember me in 5, 10, 15 years? So I think that's so good.
Mark, if you don't mind, if I jump in here, I have a question for you. What's your legacy that you want to leave behind with all that you do? If you can pinpoint it, if you pass away, what is it that you want? How do you want to be remembered?
I think all of us think about that, whether we do that directly or indirectly. We think about, what little, piece of ourselves have we left? Is that an impression upon an organization? I think, probably for me, I've been the longest serving president of this chamber. And so that will always be, I think, part of my legacy, which I'm very proud of because it's not just the organization that we've built, but it's how we built it. I always tell people I feel like we've built it the right way. We've engaged volunteers, we've been responsive, we've been relevant, we've been nimble. But I think the better part is that people know they can count on us. I was meeting with a prospect this morning, and he said, my budget's really tight. I'm not sure what I can do in terms of membership. And I said, listen, come and participate. At some point, you'll see the value, you'll find the resources. I said, but the most important thing we learned, especially over the last 3 years, which has been just excruciatingly challenging to businesses and heartbreaking to so many individuals, is that, we were there. The door never closed, the lights never went off, the phone never didn't get answered. It may have seemed at times like we were remote, but I think that's going to be a legacy, one and 1A, the organization and what we've built here as a culture, and two, how we've responded in a crisis. And those are things that are huge takeaways. And being here 30 years in this community, I don't think I would have predicted that when I moved here after grad school. But I couldn't be happier that this is where I've lived my life. I couldn't move somewhere today and have another 30 years to work. I'd be, my mid 80s, and I'd hope to be retired by then. But that network that you talk about, Gabriel, those relationships, I saw the president of Miami-Dade College the other day. She and I were both volunteers that year at the Lipton tennis tournament. That's how we met.
Hmm.
I mean, she was a, very young administrator at Miami-Dade College at the time. I was a young administrator at the University of Miami at the same time. And so we had a little bit of a bond. Who would have guessed that 30 years later, she'd be the president of the largest college in the world, and certainly doing big things here. But I can pick up the phone and say, hey, Madeline, can we do this together? Because that generation is now kind of running the show here in Miami. And didn't know it then.
Yeah.
Happy we connected then. Although I used to make fun of her because she could never remember my name. And I'm like, dude, we're both 6'3". Come on.
I love it. I love it, Mark. And that's so funny, right? Madeline's also a good friend, and it's so funny how life just works like that, right? And that's why it's so important to never burn any bridges or to never say anything that you shouldn't, because volunteer driver just like me. But then here we are, 30 years later, both of you in very prominent positions. And
Yes.
as we wrap up, well, before that, Mark, before I ask you my last question, I just want to let you know that you lead with so much grace and humility. um, I guess that would be two words that I would describe you.
It's
There's
very
many others,
kind.
but I would say grace and humility come to the top of mind when I think of you, Mark, and the way that you lead. And Gabe and I, and a lot of our listeners, as young leaders, up and coming leaders of this community, I think you are a great example to follow and to take careful notes of how you do what you do. So thank you for being here. And
Thank
really, my
you.
last question goes to that point, and it is, what advice do you have for us young professionals who are hungry for success, who are chomping at the bits to get going, to get in the workforce, and to really contribute to a city that has given us so much, Miami? What advice do you have for us as we continue on our path to greatness and success?
Well, I think you're already doing that because you're putting yourself out there. So I think first it's always, taking those risks. I think secondly is sometimes raising your hand when you're the only hand that goes up in the room. And I think the third is that, we use that phrase patience is a virtue. But when it comes to community engagement, I don't want people to be patient. I want people to be inpatient. The needs in Miami are incredible.
Mm,
I'm blessed to work with the Children's Trust, and one of the things that I learned on day one there was that we had $100 million to spend in the community for children and families, and I thought, my goodness, that's an enormous amount of money. How would we ever spend it? By the end of the meeting, that money is spent. And now, over time, as those budgets have increased and property values have increased, it's 170 million, and we still need more dollars to put into the
mm,
community to help individuals, especially children and families, to set them up for success. Miami has more haves um, than we have in the past, and we have more have-nots than we've ever had. There's not a lot in the middle, and
mm,
so for those of us who get to drive a nice car to work every day, and we know that we're going to have a great breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's no insecurity there. We have to remember that there is a tremendous aspect to our community that has daily needs. They don't necessarily know,
mm,
who's going to provide the childcare that they need so they can go to work. They don't necessarily know, where the next paycheck is going to come from, or if they're going to be able to, put food on the table. And I saw that firsthand during the pandemic as we were trying to lean into the fact that so many in our communities' needs were amplified by the pandemic. And I remember that, we were passing out diapers. Who knew that we had a nonprofit called the Miami Diaper Bank?
mm,
I didn't know that, but we gave $100,000 to them to buy diapers to give in the community that had the greatest needs, so the families would have them for their little ones.
mm,
And so we would stand in a line, and a car would pull up, and it'd have a little post-it, and it would say like one or three, meaning a 1 year old or a 3 year old. We'd pull the diapers out based on age and put them in the trunk or
mm.
the back window, depending. And
Right.
I remember after about an hour of that, it dawned on me that even if you give every family 50 diapers for each kid, do you know how long that lasts? Not even a week, because
Wow.
kids will go through 4 or 5. And here I had this idea in my head: we're helping them for the next 3 months, not having children, not having changed diapers. I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And I told the chair of the board, I said, you'll excuse me a moment. And I had to go to my car and really collect myself, because it's not something I saw every single day, but it let me know that, if there is a great thing that Miami has to offer, is that you can roll up your sleeves and do those types of things, and no one's going to say no to you. They're going to say, how can you help? Well, show up. That's how you can help.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much. I think that's so many lessons just in these 40 minutes that people can really take away. I know I have.
Thanks,
And yeah,
Gabriel.
Miami is a city that you can show up, get in, just raise your hand, like you mentioned, and get involved as quickly as you want to. So I truly appreciate you taking the time to come on here.
Pleasure.
As for the chamber, where can our listeners get involved? How can they contact you? How can they come, to your events if they're interested? Where can they find you on social media, if you don't mind sharing that?
Love to. So our website's the best in terms of calendar. That's coralgableschamber.org. Probably our social media platforms that are most active are going to be our Instagram at Gables Chamber. And check us out on LinkedIn too, in terms of Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce. Do a lot there in terms of job boards and opportunities that are out there that our members are promoting. Plus, we love to celebrate the success of our members. And, our events are going on all the time. We have a luncheon today with our women's group. Tomorrow we have a program on corporate culture with our DEI group, and then we're doing a real estate update on Thursday. So
Mm,
it's never dull here. That's the thing I think that people like most about our chamber. It's very active, but there's a little something for everybody, and I think it
Mm.
keeps us fresh and relevant, but also keeps me, very motivated and wanting to always look for the next great opportunity for our members, which in turn then helps our community grow and prosper.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I'm sure Anthony and I will see you at some of these events. Would love to
You
meet
will.
you in person, and we'll definitely love
Casa
to come.
Familia next Thursday.
Yes, sir.
next Thursday. There we
We'll be
go.
there.